that you can see this.
I can. We are in living color. Are you ready to go, Antonio?
Yes, already.
All right. Hello, everyone. We're thrilled to be here today to talk about Microsoft Information Protection. And this session is really the confluence of my passion area and Antonio's passion area as it comes to Microsoft 365. I come from a user adoption background. Antonio is the master of all things security, retention, MIP, and things like that. And we've just had a great time over the years talking about Microsoft Information Protection, sensitivity labels, retention labels, and things like that, and sharing what we know. And it really occurred to us that it's a unique view to look at both Microsoft Information Protection, security, and user adoption as being a heart and hand initiative that really needs to dovetail together. So we created this session to literally bring our two worlds together, and we just love being able to deliver it, Antonio, don't we? So
we do. We always have a good time.
Yeah, we do. So it's a pleasure being here with you all today. We certainly encourage you to. I'm watching the chat as we go through today. You're going to see Antonio and I kind of dovetail back and forth as we go through the presentation. It will be very conversational, but we welcome questions at any point in time. We'll stop and break to take a couple of questions during the session, and then we'll also have time at the end for questions as well. So with that, Antonio, let's go ahead and start rolling through the slides. Great. So obviously we have a couple of introduction slides here. Thank you so much for joining us. We wish that we were in person together, but it's wonderful to be here virtually with all of you for the Minnesota M365 Fall Admin Day Workshop. And again, thank you to all of the sponsors that have helped make this possible. And we will be having a gift card giveaway at the end of the session today, as well as the Surface Go prize later on in the day.
I would add that Sarah and I both organize events like this in our own home cities, and those events aren't possible without the sponsors. So we truly mean it when we say thank you to the sponsors for this.
We do. All right, amazing. So let me introduce myself and then I'll kick it over to Antonio. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sarah Haase. I wear a lot of hats. I'm a product manager. I am a librarian, a corporate librarian, if you will, an evangelist, and an MVP. Lately, I've been really focusing on my humans of IT labels, which are the things that are most important to me and that I'm the most passionate about. I am a woman in tech and proud to be. I'm a leader, a mentor, and most importantly, a mom. You can see all of my information there, easy ways to get a hold of me on Twitter and my blog. And then I am thrilled to be part of the Microsoft 365 Voice podcast with Antonio and Mike Matarani. So we have a great time putting that together as well.
And myself, I'm Antonio Mayo. I'm a director with a consulting company named Protivity. I'm also a senior enterprise architect there. Like Sarah, a longtime Microsoft MVP in this space, so happy to be part of that program as always. As mentioned, I'm one of the organizers, I'll say co-organizers of SharePoint Saturday Ottawa, which I think we've renamed to M365 Saturday. That's been happening throughout the community. And also a very proud member of the M365 Voice podcast. Mike Madrani, Sarah, and myself have a lot of fun doing those podcasts. So if you haven't checked them out, please see them at m365voice.com. We try to post one each week, so we're doing pretty good on that front, aren't we, Sarah? I think we've got a lot up there now. And then my blog as well. My blog and Twitter handle as well. Please feel free to reach out and connect if you've got any questions after this or want to talk about any of these topics. All right, so we're going to start off with a little bit of an introduction to MIP, or Microsoft Information Protection. We often refer to Microsoft Information Protection as MIP. Now, MIP is actually a family of products within Microsoft, within the Microsoft Security and Compliance Suite. We're going to be focusing primarily on the data classification and labeling side of it. And because this session is about security and adoption, we're going to focus primarily on the end user experience as well, as opposed to the administrative experience. Sarah, I was thinking that might be another fun session to do if we did the administrative side of MIP as well sometime, but maybe that's a topic for another day.
It is, but don't you love it? We're on a session talking about ideas for future sessions. That's realism.
Let's first start talking about what is a sensitivity label. So a sensitivity label is a label or a tag that you select for an email or document. And that tag represents the sensitivity of that piece of content to the organization. It's a really easy way for end users to identify how sensitive that content is to your company, to your organization, to your agency, wherever it is that you work. So, you address questions like, is that email confidential? Is it sensitive? Does that document contain highly sensitive information? Or does it contain personal information? Can I consider this email or document public so that I can actually share it outside of the organization with the public? Those are important questions that you need to answer when you're dealing with information. And MIP helps users to answer those questions in a really easy way by choosing an appropriate sensitivity label for that content. Now, based on the selection of that label, the organization can then automatically apply the appropriate protections and policies to that content based on whatever policies they've defined for their organization. Once the email or document is tagged and protected with that sensitivity label, the sensitivity and its protection travel with the document or email. And that's a really important point to keep in the back of your minds about this. We'll talk a bit more about that later. What that means is, though, whether that content is stored in the Microsoft Cloud, in SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive, whether it's stored on your desktop or on a network file share or in some other cloud, heaven forbid, or even in transit, it's still protected for the intended audience. So a little bit of an intro to what sensitivity labels are. Now, when we say a sensitivity label, we literally mean words like what you see here. So confidential, sensitive, top secret, classified, and the decisions you make about what words you're going to use is really important. And Sarah and I will talk about that a little bit in the second part of this presentation. But suffice it to say, when we say a sensitivity label, we mean words such as these. Now, once you choose those words, certain things can happen automatically. So first of all, if I apply a confidential label to an email or to a document, metadata is automatically inserted into that email or the document. And that's partly what we mean by the sensitivity travels with the document. It's actually inside the email or inside the document. So no matter where you store it, it still has that sensitivity label within it. That's the metadata that's stored inside the document or the email. It's not sitting in a SharePoint database or somewhere behind the scenes. It's literally inside the email or inside the document. Optionally, content markings can be applied to your email or document. And we'll take a look at what those look like in a second. As well, optionally, protections in the form of encryption can be applied to the email or document, meaning I can encrypt that email for a particular audience, or I can encrypt that document for a particular audience. And then only that audience will be able to open it, no matter where it resides or sits. And then finally, rights can be managed on it. And by rights, we mean things like prevent people from forwarding that email, or prevent people from forwarding that document in an email, prevent people from printing it, prevent people from editing it. You can get very detailed about what rights are enforced on those emails or documents. Now, to give you an example of what this looks like, here we've got a quick screenshot of Microsoft Word. And you can see there's a toolbar there. That toolbar that has those labels public, internal only, confidential. For this particular example, we chose only those three labels. You can choose those with one click on the toolbar. And then, like I mentioned, a marking can be automatically applied. Here we can see there's a header that says confidential, a footer that says confidential, and a watermark plastered across the top of it. So there's no question that this document is confidential. And again, those things can happen automatically that we mentioned, in addition to the markings. Within an email as well, I can label this email with a sensitivity label. Now, another option beyond the toolbar is this sensitivity menu that's available in Microsoft Office, right? So you've got two options. You've got that toolbar and you've got the sensitivity button in the ribbon. And again, the same label options are shown, and I can even show and hide that toolbar here if I want. Now, Sarah, you and I had a little bit of a discussion around the toolbar and so on. Any thoughts to share about that and about Office and the integration?
Yeah, so something that you and I have been talking about quite a bit over the last few months, Antonio, is the two different ways in which you can surface sensitivity labels for your users. And I know one is using this AIP client, right, which you're going to talk more about in just a couple of minutes. But it gives us the ability to have this show bar capability. And you can see, you can click on the sensitivity button, click on show bar, and it will literally insert the bar going across your Outlook, Excel, Word, and PowerPoint. You can turn on the show bar in all of those programs, where your sensitivity labels are right there at the top of your page, They're very easy, 1 or 2 clicks to select a sensitivity label, and it's always visible. Then you have the native labeling capability, correct? That's part of newer versions of Office. And I think it's important to point out that which of the mechanisms that companies choose in terms of that AIP client show bar experience or the native experience is going to be important in terms of what shows for users and the impacts of making that choice. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So you raise a great point. There are, in fact, 2 different pieces of software at play here. First of all, Microsoft Office, and we literally mean Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook, have this sensitivity button built right into them. So without pushing out any new software to desktops, if I configure sensitivity labels, they appear here in the menu. There is no toolbar with that. So if you only use the built-in native labeling within Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook, you don't have this show bar option, but you have the same sensitivity labels and much of the same functionality. The other piece of software, go ahead.
I just want to point out that if you're going to use that native labeling, please make sure that you validate what versions of Office your users are on. And one key call out that you and I have both discovered recently, if the majority of your users are on the semi-annual channel for updates to Office, they may not have all of the capabilities for that native labeling when they're working in their desktop applications. They'll have it in the Office Online, like the browser-based versions, but they might not have it in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook installed on their desktops, in which case some of your required labels, et cetera, may not act in a way that you would expect it to for those semi-annual update users. So that's an important call out.
Absolutely. What I was going to say was the second piece of software at play here is an additional AIP labeling client that you can push out to people's desktops. Now, again, you can use sensitivity labels with this ribbon button, the sensitivity ribbon button, without pushing out the extra AIP sensitivity label, the AIP unified labeling client it's called. But what that AIP unified labeling client adds, first of all, is the toolbar. Second is the next piece of functionality I'm going to talk about here, labeling things like PDFs and other files on your desktop. But Sarah brought up a great point. If you rely on just the native functionality in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook, and your users are on the semi-annual updates for Office, you're only going to receive updates to that client, to that capability, semi-annually. Whereas if you push out the AIP unified labeling client, we have found that updates, at least I have found that updates are coming more frequently to that piece of software. And you get the additional capabilities of the toolbar, as well as the ability to label PDFs and other functionality. So it's an important decision to make if you are going to roll out the client or not. I tend to recommend rolling out the AIP Unified Labeling Client because I do think you get updates sooner, especially with that semi-annual update. And there are some tangible features and benefits on top of what's there natively. The other little bit to show here is in this particular example, that confidential label is going to encrypt this document for a particular group. So after I've done that and sent that email, here we can see in this example that it's been labeled. So my email to Sarah has been labeled with a header and footer, classification confidential in red to make it stand out. And you do have options around the colors when you do configure this. As well, you can see here that it is being encrypted with this lock button, and it tells you what the confidential label means to people that receive it. It also tells you that permissions were granted by me. So this was actually labeled by myself. So you can see that here, or the recipient can see it here. So this is an example of after you've sent an email that I've labeled confidential, this is what it looks like to the person that's received it. As well, you can see there's no watermark here, right? Outlook emails in general don't support watermarks. So those headers, footers, and watermarks, those markings will adjust depending on which application or piece of content you're applying them to. Now, the next piece of functionality we quickly wanted to introduce you to is the ability to encrypt PDF files. Now, this comes with rolling out the AIP Unified Labeling Client to desktops. So you don't get this with the native experience of Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook. To label a PDF file, I simply right-click on that PDF file in the File Explorer. I choose Classify and Protect. Dialog's going to appear with the same options that you saw, the same sensitivity label options, and I can choose from these here. And this is not just for PDF files, this is in fact for any file type. You do get a little bit of a different user experience depending on the kind of file that you protect. For example, PDF files natively support MIP sensitivity labels and protections. So after I label it, the PDF file is still going to look like a PDF file. But if I take another kind of file, let's say a JPEG, and I do the same thing here, it's actually going to become a PJPEG file. It's actually P standing for protected. JPEGs don't, they partially natively support protection, so you end up with this PJPEG extension. And then other files like, let's say CAD drawings will end up as just .cad.p file. So it adds this additional extension on the end and behaves accordingly. And then finally, another capability of MIP sensitivity labels is the ability to label Microsoft Teams, sites, and M365 groups as well. Once my labels are configured for groups, teams, and sites, and it is a slightly additional configuration that you need to do in the Compliance Center. When a user goes to create a team or a site, that's when they are presented with the selection of what is the sensitivity label for this team or this site. And that's really supposed to represent, I'll say, the highest level of sensitivity of information that's going to be stored in that team or site. That's what it intended to represent. So if I have a site or a team that's labeled as confidential, it's designated for storing confidential information. Whereas if I have a team or site that's labeled as public, it's designated for storing public information, not confidential information. So you do need to think a little bit about which label you're going to choose. Now, once I've applied that label, it's surfaced a little bit differently in those. So within a team, I'm going to see the confidential label, in this case, up in the top right-hand corner. Whereas with a SharePoint site, I'm going to see it in the top left-hand corner. So not that far off from each other, but just suffice to say it is in slightly different positions. Now, once that is assigned to a team, a site, or a group, certain policies can be automatically enforced. And they are different policies from those on emails and documents. The policies are things like I can force a team or a site to be private or public. I can allow or prevent group owners from adding external guests. And that actually, I think, is a great feature, because what that means is you don't have to make a decision of we are not going to allow external guests or we are going to allow external guests. You can be a lot more, I'll say, granular about the decision. You can say, we're going to allow external guests on public sites, but we're not going to allow them on confidential sites or sensitive sites. You can make those kinds of decisions on a site-by-site basis simply by a user choosing the right sensitivity label. You can also control the sharing options that are available for SharePoint sites. So for example, if I'm going to allow anonymous guest links or new and existing users or only existing external users, or if I want to block external sharing altogether. And then finally, I can decide on what the user experience is like from unmanaged devices. So for a particular site, I can say we're going to prevent or block unmanaged devices, or I can say we're going to allow unmanaged devices, or I can even say we're going to allow a web-only view to unmanaged devices, and we're going to prevent downloading of documents. And that's a great feature because it allows external, people who are on an unmanaged device to still access a team or a site, but have a web-only view of it. They can still interact and work with documents in the web versions of Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, but they're not allowed to download any content. So your content doesn't remain on personal devices or unmanaged devices without controls.
One of the most interesting challenges that I have, Antonio, is that when I talk to users about the sensitivity labels for Teams and for SharePoint Online sites, is that they tend to assume that as soon as they add a sensitivity label to a team or a site, all the documents stored therein inside the team or inside the site automatically get the sensitivity label. And that's not the case. Do you want to talk about that and about how you present that to users?
You're absolutely right. It's a great point. A lot of people ask about that. When I do apply a sensitivity label to a team or a site, it does not affect the documents stored within that team or site at all. It doesn't change the classification on those documents. It doesn't alter them in any way. There are, however, controls like what we've mentioned here that are applied to all the content on the team or the site. In addition, there can be automated alerts that get sent to users that say, you've stored a confidential document on a site that's labeled as public. You should reconsider where that's being stored. So I think that's a really important point to communicate to people, because it's you know, applying a sensitivity label to documents is really about thinking about what care do I want people to apply to this content. But it's when we apply them then to teams or sites, it's also to get people to think about where am I going to store these? Because seeing that this site is confidential is going to have the person that comes to it, really approach this site in a certain way, and it's going to potentially, I'll say, it's going to make them adjust their behavior within this site. What kind of information they store on it? Do they share it? Do they treat it with more care than they do on a public site, which is what they should do, right? So I do think there's benefit here in having greater visibility into the sensitivity of the information to the organization.
Lovely. So I know we're about to move on to another section. Before we do, Antonio, we do have a couple of questions, if you're okay with me reading those out before we move on. The first question is from Michael. He asks, can you give an overview of how to enable Azure Information Protection, or AIP?
So that's a big question. That's a whole other session, but we can try to, in a nutshell, talk about that maybe, Sarah?
In a nutshell.
Yeah, we'll try. So I would say the place where you, well, we're going to talk about some of the places where you start in just a minute. I feel like that's a good question for us to come back to at the end, Sarah, because I think we're going to cover a little bit of that in just the next few sections. I find the next few sections around deciding what your sensitivity labels are, what the configuration of them are, that's kind of a fundamental piece to enabling it. The actual mechanics of turning it on are actually pretty easy in the Compliance Center. You go to Information Protection, you create your sensitivity labels, you then create sensitivity label policies to publish them to users, and you can publish them to different user groups. But the more critical fundamental thing, I think, is the questions we're about to address.
I would agree. It's more about the why, and not to deflect the question, but I know, Antonio, you've done a lot of sessions and workshops around the actual mechanics of how you enable, and that isn't really what we're going to be getting into here. But Michael, we recommend coming back at the end and asking more specific questions. We have another interesting question from Steve, and this one's pretty fascinating. I like it. He says, we provide the ability for our users to use File Explorer to sync with a personal OneDrive and departmental SharePoint Online sites. Great, love that. Can sensitivity labels still apply in Windows Explorer? Do they see the notices and warnings?
Interesting.
And the answer is yes, you can still apply sensitivity labels using Explorer, using that AIP client that Antonio just showed you. And remember that it doesn't matter where the file is stored. You can apply a sensitivity label if you've rolled out that AIP client using Windows Explorer, even if you're going into access a file via the OneDrive sync client, or you're accessing a SharePoint document library via that the sync client, that you can still right click on a file and choose classify and protect, and it will work and apply that sensitivity label, right, Antonio?
Absolutely. There are some limitations to be aware of, though. So I just went back to this slide here to show what the experience is like in the Windows File Explorer. So right, whether you're on your desktop, whether you're in the Windows File Explorer on some file, whether you're in your OneDrive synced folder on your desktop, you can do exactly what you see here. You right-click on any file. You can even multi-select files, right-click and select Classify and Protect, and then select that label here. This will apply the protections to the documents automatically, right? So all the settings around protections, rights management still get applied to the document. I think we do have a bit of a misnomer here. I might have to correct, Sarah, as I say this. It does not apply markings to the documents, though, when you do classify them this way. So that is one, I'll say.
And by markings, you mean a header, a footer, or a watermark that you define. You're quite right. If you use the Windows Explorer view, right-click, classify and protect to add a sensitivity label, it will not automatically insert that header, footing, or watermark that you have configured. That only happens when you use the sensitivity button built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, or Outlook.
Right. Yeah. So that's one important, I'll say, difference to be aware of. So might need to, we should correct that on this slide, I'm just realizing.
Last question, I think, and then we can move on to the next section. From Matt, can you control the public versus private setting of a team using AIP?
Yes, absolutely. So when you do here choose a sensitivity label for your team or your site, and that's typically done when you first create it, that will control the public and private setting of your team. That's one of your configuration options when you're configuring these labels for groups, teams, or sites. Do you want to force it to be private? Do you want to force it to be public? Do you want to give the user the option?
Love it. Good questions.
All right, so over to you, Sarah.
Perfect. So in this next section, Antonio and I really wanted to talk about some of the whys. What should you think about when you're setting up your strategy around how you want to deploy Microsoft Information Protection? What kinds of configuration choices or options should you really think about? And what have we seen in the wild that have left us thinking that the key things that companies really need to think about as they're defining their strategy? So Antonio, if you want to go to the next slide, these are some high-level theories, and we're going to take time to break down each one. First, make sure that you keep your sensitivity levels to a manageable number. These sensitivity labels are going to have to be understood by every employee and contractor in your organization, especially if you're going to make these sensitivity labels required for every email that is sent or every Word, Excel, and PowerPoint file that is edited or created. So they're going to be very important. And the number of labels, how granular there are, and the volume of them that your users are going to have to learn and understand is very important. So when we talk about sensitivity labels, Antonio and I think, always say when we're having conversations, talking with people about it or talking about it on our podcast, we always say it's that magical 4 labels plus or minus 2 is kind of the rubric that we like to use. If you have more than 6 labels, if you've got 8 labels or 10, or I've heard of companies that have 20 or more sensitivity labels, it becomes nearly impossible for your users to understand the fine distinction points of what each of the different sensitivity labels are. Quite simply, it shouldn't be as hard as insurance. It shouldn't require a master's level knowledge to be able to understand how you distinguish between the sensitivity labels. Keeping them to a manageable number ensures that your users will have a better opportunity of truly understanding the sensitivity labels and where their documents and their emails fit in which sensitivity label it should fit into. So remember, fewer labels are going to be easier for your users. They'll make less mistakes as they're applying those sensitivity labels. If you think about it from an end user's perspective, as they're authoring an email, they have to choose a sensitivity label. As they're creating or editing a Word, Excel, or PowerPoint document, they have to choose a sensitivity label. For how many emails and documents our users touch every day, that's a lot of decisions that they have to make for each and every one of those emails and files. So we want to make sure that we're making it as simple and clear as we can. So keeping your sensitivity labels to a manageable number will help ensure your users can understand it, that they can apply those sensitivity labels with confidence, and that they make fewer errors in applying the wrong sensitivity label to the content that they're labeling. So you're going to increase adoption of your sensitivity labels, accuracy of your sensitivity labels, and ultimately be able to trust them more as being clear distinctions of what type of content is in an email or a file.
I would add one more point to what you said, Sarah, just around the confidence around accuracy of labels that are assigned. Just to illustrate how important it is, when you do have too many labels, when it is too difficult for users to choose the right label, you run some significant risks of users either over-classifying information or under-classifying information. If you under-classify information, then you run the risk of that information getting exposed when it shouldn't be. If you over-classify information, then you run the risk of users not being able to access information that they need to do their job. And in some instances, that can be really critical information, depending on the type of organization that you're in. So think about it also in terms of those risks. It is important that end users understand what label to apply in what circumstance, but also when they receive information that's labeled a certain way, how to handle it. And keeping your labels to a meaningful number really helps with that.
So let's talk about overclassification for a minute, Antonio, because this is a conversation you and I have had many times. I tend to see organizations think about leaning into sensitivity labels so much that they they think overclassifying is better. And when we say overclassifying, that means, hey, let's make sure that our default sensitivity label, for example, is always the highest level, or let's err into classifying everything as our most sensitive content as opposed to less sensitive content. And you and I talk frequently about how that isn't a great idea, Because if you always classify everything as the most of something, in reality, you're not getting the finer distinctions between your data sets. You're not able to truly understand the differences in the types of email and document content that you have if you're leaning into classifying everything so heavily in an extreme state. You just alluded to the fact that it also has real-time implications in how employees work. Do you want to talk about the email example that you often mention?
Email example. I'm trying to remember which one.
About the encryption of email if you have every email tagged as your most sensitive content.
Oh, yes, that's right. So that's a great point. I've run across a couple of organizations that want to turn on protection or encryption for every single classification label. And the challenge you run into with that, especially if it's your default, is that every email ends up encrypted. Every email ends up with a high level of protection. And despite how critical you think the information is in your organization, in many organizations, most information is not that sensitive, right? It depends very much on the organization, but in some I'll say in some organizations, you do run across where most of the information is considered very, very sensitive, so you have to protect it all. Okay, so those examples exist. But the vast majority of organizations, most of our information is just the back and forth that we exchange every day. Where we don't want it to get outside, but if it did, we're not going to lose sleep over it. So it's important to not overclassify information, not have an encrypting sensitivity label as your default, especially in email. It does affect the user experience in Outlook. It really can slow down every user's ability to open and access emails in Outlook, where I click on an email that's protected and I wait 1, 2, 3 seconds, and then it comes back, and Outlook's been frozen for those 3 or 4 seconds. And that happens on every single email. Now the performance is getting better. I have noticed Microsoft making improvements to that, but still you lose all sense of what information is sensitive and what information is not sensitive in our organization. And you want to be able to get that analytics so you can see where sensitive information is flowing. And you don't want the noise of everything appearing sensitive, because then you have no analytics and you have no idea of where sensitive information exists, where it's moving, because everything looks sensitive.
Exactly.
All right, so the next topic we want to talk about is how you name your labels. So I love the title of this one, Naming is Everything. So when you choose the names of your labels, so whether it's confidential or sensitive or restricted or any of these types of words, or secret or top secret, think about your company culture and the employee's experience. Think about it from their perspective. Don't use acronyms just to make it easy for project teams or for others to say the thing, right? Don't use acronyms, because a lot of users, especially new people that come into your organization, don't know what acronyms mean. It's really helpful if you build a glossary for your organization so that it's easy for people to understand what's supposed to be confidential, what's supposed to be internal only, what's supposed to be public. Does public mean this can be released to the public? Or does it simply mean you can share with anybody internally, right? There's that fine distinction around these. And having a glossary that defines these labels and perhaps has other definitions around what sensitive information is in your organization is really helpful for users. We find most users and organizations want to do the right thing with information, right? They come to work, they work a hard day, they want to do the right thing, they go home to their families. And for those, it's often a matter of simply letting them know what is the right thing to do and defining the labels clearly with easy to recognize names that fits into your culture, and having easy places where you can see what those labels mean is really important to end up with that effect. Now, the next topic we wanted to mention was around picking a default and whether or not you make your labels required. Now, whether you have a default label and whether your labels are required for all emails as documents is, I'll say, a critical decision you make before rolling out MIP. You want to be very definite about these decisions, right? You want these decisions to be decisive, not to be wishy-washy, not for there to be any question in users' minds as to whether they should label something or not. Because if you give users an out on labeling something, or if you make it too hard for them to decide, should I label this or not? You often result in documents and emails not getting labeled because people don't know what the right thing is to do. You kind of add to that notion of, I don't know whether this is sensitive or not. I don't know which label to apply. And the easy out is don't. I tend to recommend that that organizations do choose a default label for all their content, and that they make labels required. By making labels required, there's no more question about, do I label this thing or not? Everything must be labeled. From this point forward, our organization is going to label every email, every document. I realize that it's, you probably have to sell a decision like that within an organization, but once you've made that decision, then for the end user, there's no more question. It just becomes part of your culture to label documents and emails. And then I also recommend that you choose a default. And your default will be the hardest label for you to choose. I'll get back to that point in a second. I recommend that you choose a default because, like I said earlier, the vast majority of the information in your organization is probably not that sensitive. You don't want it to get out. You want it to stay internal, but it's usually that internal communication, lots of emails and replies back and forth that don't require encryption and don't require the highest level of sensitivity. And I typically recommend that label be the default because it's going to represent the bulk of your content. Then your users need to decide what label to choose when they are in fact dealing with sensitive information, right? So the times where they need to choose the right label, I think lessens, and you end up making it easier on your users to pick the right label because it's really about sensitive information. It's not about every single email and every single document. And there's usually a bell curve that we see of, some information is, I'll say, public and can be released externally. More information, the most information, tends to be non-sensitive. And then you've got some which is kind of that next level of sensitivity, call it confidential, where we really don't want this to get out because it would be embarrassing. And then there's that smaller set of information, which is the company's or organization's most sensitive information, usually called highly sensitive, highly confidential, restricted, some label like that, which is encrypted, which you do need to consider who's going to get access to this very carefully.
And I think one important thing that you and I talk about is that if you decide to make sensitivity labels required, and you can make it required for emails and documents or just documents, but if you're going to make it required, pick a default label, please, please. Your users will thank you, because otherwise they're going to hit a speed bump every time they try and send an email. If you have made labels required and you haven't chosen a default, every time they try and send an email or reply or forward an email, every time they try and save a file, they're going to get that prompt. So choosing a default, you can expect that a vast majority of your content will be labeled with that default label, but much more effective than a speed bump integration for your users at every action, tens or hundreds of times a day per user.
Right. I have run across organizations that make labels required and don't choose a default because they want to make every user think about what label they're going to apply. And although from a security perspective, that sounds wonderful, the practicality of users' day-to-day work is really impacted negatively. Like Sarah just mentioned, every single email you send, a pop-up comes up, oh, I got to pick a label. Every single document you save, I need to pick a label, and a little pop-up comes up. You're literally introducing that extra step hundreds of times a day.
Ah ouais, mais Diff, là.
Well, I think we've got somebody.
Yeah, Doug, if you could help us out with muting.
Already got them. Had to find them in the list.
Thanks, Doug.
I just want to make sure there were 2 more questions just throw in the chat as well.
Yep, we'll get to them.
Okay, perfect.
So Antonio, can you go back to that slide? Because I have one more point and then we'll stop and pause for a couple of questions. But earlier on, we had a discussion about the way in which the software at play to manage sensitivity labels. And we said that one of the big advantages of using the AIP client is that when you're using Outlook, Word, PowerPoint, or Excel, the full desktop applications, you have the ability to turn on Show Bar, which inserts your sensitivity labels on a bar at the top of your email or your document. It displays the sensitivity label that is currently assigned and makes it very easy to choose a label. From a practicality perspective, I've seen this be very key for users that frankly like having that show bar experience, because even if they do have a default label, it reminds them to check that default label, to update that default label, or to make it easy to choose a sensitivity label without having to click on the sensitivity button, without having to right click on a file in Windows Explorer. So I would recommend that you think carefully if you're going to have required labels about that show bar experience, because your users may really appreciate it as having something that is a continual visual prompt and reminder about their sensitivity labels.
Absolutely. It gives you that one click and that quick glance and see what the label is.
So let's cover a couple of questions quickly before we move on. I'm going to start with Eric's first. What default label settings do you find to be a good balance between security and productivity? Have some protection, but not completely public, like a company-only label.
So it's a great question. I think we were just talking about that a little bit. The best option, the best default option in my view, is the label that represents the majority of information in your company, which is probably not public. It's certainly not the most sensitive. It's somewhere in the middle. And again, it's going to be the hardest one to choose. You're going to debate it, and you're going to debate what it's called quite a bit, right? Some organizations call it general, some call it general business, some call it internal. So it's usually that label. It's just the name of it very much depends on your company culture. That would be my recommendation, at least.
I would agree. Second question from Steve, is there a distinction that you make when to use DLP versus AIP for email?
When to use DLP versus AIP?
Mm-hmm.
I would say you use both. They both serve different purposes in my view, both important purposes, but different purposes. AIP is very much about users choosing a sensitivity label for their emails or their documents. So you're getting the user's input into how do I want the recipients of this to treat it? The idea being the author of an email or document is probably best positioned to understand what the sensitivity of it is. DLP is, in my view, doing automatic scans of the emails you're sending, looking for sensitive data types. So, credit card numbers, social security numbers, passport numbers, this kind of thing, and reacting to those patterns in ways that you define in your policies, whether it is to show a tip, whether it is to send an email alert, whether it is to block the sending of it. So to me, those are two different things, but equally important, and they should coexist. I have been involved in many rollouts of both, and we're usually rolling out both at around the same time, because your DLP policies can actually look at the sensitivity labels of your emails and documents as well and react to those. So it's important to kind of incorporate that together. I would say often when rolling out DLP, we first roll out a set of policies in monitor mode only, so we're not impacting the end users, so that we can get analytics on where is sensitive data in an organization, what kind of sensitive data is there, where does it move, who's it shared with, and then based on what we see in those analytics, define how we proceed with DLP policies, right? If I'm being a little long-winded here, but if you think about DLP policies are really about looking for automated patterns, right? And sometimes you can't look for those, right? For example, a contract could be considered very sensitive, but there's no social security number in it. There's no passport number in it. There's nothing that I can look for through an automated pattern. And keywords end up giving you a lot of false positives. So when it comes to those kinds of documents, AIP, I think, really shines because the author of that contract can say, this is confidential. And then your DLP policies can look at that.
Okay, let's take one more question and then we're going to move on. Can you have different default labels for different groups of people? Maybe a more restrictive default label for those that work with sensitive data regularly.
So what do you think about this? Let you take this one first.
You know what, this is tough. This is something that I've debated before with companies. And the hard part about this is it's very difficult to account for how employees move in an organization. If you think about it, we have employees that are in departments that get reorganized. Maybe they move from corporate communications to HR to IT to legal, and their departments get shuffled. Or what happens when you have employees that take on new roles within the organization. The ongoing management of granularly managing a role or an employee to have a different sensitivity label default will be very difficult. I also think the user education around that will be even more difficult because those users are going to get accustomed to having a default label. If that default label is different for their department or their specific job focus, and then they change roles, I think it could lead to a whole lot of errors in how those sensitivity labels are done. So while I think it looks good on paper, I think the actual implementation and ongoing support of it is frankly kind of a nightmare.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, Sarah. Like the mechanics of it are, you certainly can do that. You can have different sensitivity label policies that push out different labels to different groups of people in your organization. And you can choose a different default for each of those policies. So I could configure my leadership team has one default, my legal team has a different default, the rest of my users have another default. But Sarah, I think you bring up a good point that the management of that on an ongoing basis can be a real nightmare. And practically, it may or may not work for your organization. So I would you just think carefully about whether you want to do that or not. And if you do, I would do that sparingly.
Agreed. You also have to think about how your organization onboards people, how they get credentials in their systems, making sure that they would be credentialed appropriately for some kind of a departmental difference. I think it's, like I said, it looks good on paper. The reality of it is very difficult. Right. So I know that we have more questions, but Antonio, I'm going to suggest for right now, let's go ahead and keep moving forward, and then we can open it up for questions again a little bit later.
Sounds good.
So within the vein of these determinations and considerations for your organizational strategy, we really think it's important for you to think about how you're going to label or display your sensitivity labels. Earlier in the session, Antonio showed some examples of documents and emails that had header informations or headers that were injected when you choose a sensitivity label. For example, a header that demarcates the email or the file as being confidential based on the confidential sensitivity label being applied. Same thing with a footer. You can automatically insert a footer. Now, or you could have a watermark that splashes across the page or the document. Now, it may be very compelling and desirable to insert these headers, footers, and watermarks. A couple of considerations that you'll need to keep in mind. If you roll out the AIP client, enabling your users to add sensitivity labels via Windows Explorer, these headers, footers, and watermarks will not be applied, meaning that they could apply a sensitivity label via Windows Explorer to a Word document, and that Word document won't have the header, footer, or watermark that would render if they went in and opened up the Word document and applied a sensitivity label inside the Word document. This can be somewhat, my favorite word, discombobulating for your users, because sometimes they'll see a header or a footer in a Word document to indicate the sensitivity label, and sometimes they won't. And the only difference is not the validity of the label, but how the label was applied, whether it was applied in Word or whether it was applied in Windows Explorer using that classify and protect option. So you want to think carefully about that. I would also think carefully about what kind of a display is useful and what kind of a display might be heavy-handed. We've talked a lot about this show bar option that you can turn on if you're using the AIP client. You can select show bar or encourage your users or have the default turned on so that that bar appears at the top of the page where it shows the current sensitivity label that's applied to the document or the email. It enables them to quickly change it. That in and of itself is a display of a kind, and it's going to be consistent across use of Outlook, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint from a desktop application perspective. The most important thing to think about, I think, if you're going to configure a custom display for your label in a header, in a footer, or a watermark, is to be consistent as far and wide as you can. I've actually seen companies that have information security required training for their users that give different instructions for different applications. For example, they say to use a watermark in your Excel documents to mark them as internal content, but use a footer in a Word document to mark them as internal content. I think that that's very confusing for users to see different strategies in different locations. As Antonio mentioned earlier, you can't have a watermark on your Outlook emails. It's just simply not a function of what Outlook enables you to do. So make sure that if you're going to enter into using any of these displays for your labels, that you try and pick something that's going to be consistent as much as you can make it across your organization so users can predictably know where they can go, how those sensitivity labels will render, and that they're never confused about how to see the sensitivity labels for their files or their emails. Another important thing to think about is color coding. Antonio showed example of sensitivity labels that had red footers or headers or watermarks. Just make sure that you're thinking about accessibility. If you're going to be doing color coding, you're also thinking about localization and differences in geography and cultures across the world. Many of us may not be able to distinguish green text on a white background or yellow text on a white background. So, make sure that you're thinking about those that might have visual accessibility differences, cultural differences, and things like that that might make it hard to see those sensitivity labels. So please be sensitive to that. And then make sure that you take advantage of some of the capabilities that are built into the system. If you're going to use that native labeling of sensitivity labels that we've talked about, you have the ability when you deploy MIP to be able to configure the Learn More link that will show up in your sensitivity dropdown with that native labeling experience. That Learn More link you can configure to take users to a hyperlink to, let's say, a SharePoint communication site where they can learn more about your sensitivity labels and how they work. If you're using the AIP client, you can also configure a help hyperlink. It shows up and displays kind of differently. Antonio, can you help me remember how they get to it? It's a little bit harder if they're using the AIP client because it isn't a Learn More link.
That's right. That's right. There is a, I have to actually go back and show it. If it's okay if I go back here, Sarah, for a second?
Sure.
Sure. So really quick on these. When we saw the menu here, you would click on help and feedback, and then a little dialogue comes up that is like an about box, and there's a tell me more link in there, and that's what takes you to the same page that you would with the learn more link.
Perfect. Oh, we're going fast. Okay, so this leads us into the next section of the presentation where we want to talk about adoption strategies. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the session today, it's really important that you think about not only your security needs as it relates to these sensitivity labels, but that you also consider user adoption of the sensitivity labels to make sure that your users are familiar and that they're comfortable with the security and compliance strategy that you have and your sensitivity labels. And if there's anything that's hard to do, it's to make users comfortable with security and compliance measures. So just know that we have an uphill climb on this one. But Antonio, if we can go ahead and go into the adoption strategy section and click on the next slide, I do have some recommendations for you. Adoption of sensitivity labels requires that your employees understand why. They need to understand why we're doing this from a company perspective. They need to understand what the labels are used for, what the downstream impacts are, and why they need to take the time, make the time to apply these sensitivity labels well. As Antonio mentioned, most of our employees want to come in and do the right thing every day, but they also have natural questions of, is this just another thing that you want me to do? How is this actually going to be used? How is it going to benefit the company? How's it going to benefit my department and my business goals? How's it going to benefit me as an employee? What's in it for me? What's in it for the organization? What impact this will have? You need to make sure that you can address those types of questions in a very clear way for your end users so that they can understand why they need to care about your security and compliance strategy and why they need to care about sensitivity labels. If you can tie this initiative to something that will actually save them time in the long run, that's going to be a key thing to mention. I'll give you a great example. I've heard of organizations that sometimes have manual encryption requirements for documents containing their most sensitive type of information. However, if you roll out something like MIP, maybe if they're going to use sensitivity labels, you could set up to have documents auto-encrypt if they're the most sensitive type of information, thereby saving employees the time and effort to manually encrypt their content. This is a huge win for your employees. If you're in a situation like that, make sure that you lean into that and actually explain how this will help us to protect our data. This will help us to protect our customers' data, confidentiality of information, and save you clicks, time, effort, and energy as you go through your day-to-day job. I would also recommend, there we go, that you create some kind of a home location for Microsoft information protection. I really recommend that you take the time to create a SharePoint communication site. Could be a SharePoint site of any kind, but I think a communication site is well suited to this effort. This is going to be the location where your users can go to learn everything that they need to know about Microsoft information protection and their sensitivity labels. Keep in mind that you want to give it a meaningful name. I can't think of anything worse than telling my users that, hey, we're implementing a project called data classification or Microsoft information protection. It's for your benefit, so please learn about it. Because the name data classification or Microsoft information protection means something to us, but will it mean something to every employee in our company? So make sure that whatever you name this initiative, you make it clear, you make it meaningful, and you use it consistently everywhere. As part of the SharePoint communication site, please make sure that you put together a glossary. You should have clear definitions for each of your sensitivity labels. As we've already discussed, you should also name those sensitivity labels effectively, not using acronyms, not using internal or terms that are unique to your organization, but try and make them clear and simple and easy to understand as possible, and have a glossary that clearly defines what is a sensitivity label, defines each of the sensitivity labels in your organization, and what the name of this overall initiative is, keeping in mind that you don't have to use the Microsoft product name of Microsoft Information Protection to refer to this effort in your company. You can name your security initiative, your sensitivity label initiative, something unique for you. I always love giving a short URL or a redirect to the site to make sure that they don't have to memorize a long path to get there. We want to try and make it as quick and easy as possible to be able to get to the site. So for example, if you want to name your initiative sensitivity, then create a short URL of sensitivity / will always take them to the SharePoint communication site where they can learn more. On this site, when you're creating your glossary, you also want to make sure that you're clearly defining what each of your sensitivity labels are, and you want to provide examples of the types of content that would fall into each sensitivity label. You want clear examples of what types of information is internal or confidential, for example, or what types of information might be considered private, which might be your most sensitive information. You also want to provide non-examples for each of your sensitivity labels, providing both examples of what falls within the scope of a sensitivity label and non-examples of things that fall outside the scope of that sensitivity label will help your users to be able to more closely crystallize on when to use each sensitivity label. Remember, as soon as you are done with your configuration, the success of your sensitivity labeling and your security and compliance initiative lies in the hands of your end users and your employees and how they apply those sensitivity labels. So the strength of your entire program is really hinges on the success of the employee who pays the least amount of attention to the training that you're offering around sensitivity labels. So you really need to make sure that you're thinking about this as a communal property, a communal effort, and your education and training and creating a communication site like this one to help drive adoption is going to be key. Make sure that you think about documenting user scenarios, that you're thinking about a user experience. How would I using sensitivity labels impact what happens when I create a document, or I upload a document to OneDrive, or I create an email, or I forward an email? How is this going to impact my day-to-day working life? And then, of course, I'm always a huge proponent of using Yammer. Make sure that if Yammer is something that you do have within your organization, that you're creating a community in Yammer where people can go to ask questions and get feedback, and maybe be able to engage with your team about, I have this particular document, I had no idea what kind of sensitivity label to use. Gives them the opportunity to be able to ask questions, and then make sure that you have help available for them to be able to answer that. Okay, Antonio, next slide. Perfect. So here's an example of what a SharePoint communication site might look like. Just make sure that you're thinking about building something that is attractive, that's informational. Again, the target audience for this will be every employee of your company to come in and learn more. Make sure that you're running training classes for them, You have recorded training events. You have quick video snippets available for them to teach them how to apply these sensitivity labels. Really, this is the marriage of not only do we need security and compliance, but we need an adoption program to help every single employee and contractor in our organization be able to adopt those sensitivity labels and use them appropriately. So within this, you also are going to need to think about a marketing campaign for sensitivity labels. And if that's not something that you've ever thought of before, oh boy, the fun. So a lot of times we think about driving adoption strategies for Office 365, for OneDrive, to get people to voluntarily adopt. But the marketing campaign that you run around your sensitivity labels might be the most important marketing campaign that you ever perform, because the entirety of your security and compliance initiative rests on how accurately your employees can apply sensitivity labels to their emails and to their documents. Fortunately, Microsoft actually does a really good job of providing examples in terms of materials and content that you can use for a marketing campaign for sensitivity labels and MIP. And I've included in here the URL. We're happy to make these slides available afterwards, but this will take you to a zip file where you can actually download Microsoft example materials that you can use as part of your internal communication strategy and marketing campaign. And I wanted to highlight just a couple of examples. So Antonio, if we can go to the next slide. As part of this, Microsoft gives you PowerPoint slides like this one that actually shows some marketing materials. The best thing is this isn't just an image. This will actually be part of that zip file download. It's a PowerPoint slide. You can edit and change this. You can see here that they visually represented a fictitious company and their 5 sensitivity labels that you can see stacked up in the safes on the right. But this gives you some ideas and actually gives you an editable PowerPoint visual image that you can use to create some of your own materials. In addition, if we can go to the next slide, they also have examples of email communications and other communications, Teams, channel posts, and things like that, EMRL company announcements, etc., that you can actually use. And what I love about this is that I rarely take wholesale the communication examples from Microsoft, but there's nothing harder than when you're starting to build an adoption or a communications campaign, starting from a blank screen. So it's really helpful to sometimes see the verbiage that Microsoft recommends or uses as an examples, because it gives you a great jumping off point for you to think about as you're creating your own communications. And then the last example that I have in here, they also put together some creative items. For example, hey, next virtual town hall or in-person departmental meeting that you have at work, you could run a quiz or you can run a game show with prizes around sensitivity labels and asking questions to have your users try and guess, hey, which sensitivity label is the right one to apply for this specific type of content or this specific type of file. So it's a very helpful set of files in the zip file from the marketing perspective. And I just saw that we had a question about the URL, and I will go ahead and copy and paste that into the chat. Again, it'll lead you to a zip file that you can download with some of these Microsoft examples within it. Any additional thoughts on this section, Antonio?
So I'm getting a bit of an echo. Okay, hopefully the echo will go away. Okay, it's gone away. So I do think the strategies that you proposed here are really critical to rolling out MIP, more so than the settings. The mechanics of actually setting it up and pushing it out are really easy. The planning around choosing the right labels for your organization, rolling out the solution using a marketing campaign, as you said, is really, really important. We often do this first as a POC within an organization. And from that POC, getting some learnings, understanding how it might affect business processes, adjusting not only the settings, but the marketing campaign so that the language really speaks to the rest of users. So Sarah, I think both you and I have done these rollouts, first starting with a POC and then rolling out to the rest of the organization. And I think we've seen different scales on the level of POC. Whereas, some of my recent clients or POCs have been 20 users, 30 users, 50 users. In your case, they've been thousands of users within a POC. So I think that's great, actually. I think the notion that the POCs can work at both scales is really important. So yeah, I think this is one of the most critical things that you can do, coming up with a marketing campaign as part of the rollout. And then I think we're going to move to wrapping things up, and then we're going to take a few questions.
Mm-hmm.
So like we've been talking about just now, you really do have to sell this type of solution to your organization. It's not something that will sell itself. It is sometimes an extra thing that you're asking your users to do. So as Sarah mentioned a few moments ago, it's really important that they understand why, and that you make really solid decisions about how you explain that to people, and how you build in the benefits to people as well, how you help them to understand why this is a benefit to them and how this helps them in their day-to-day.
Yeah, I would really agree, because without adoption of MIP, the moral of the story is that without adoption by your end users and by all of your employees, you might achieve a compliance if you have required sensitivity labels, but you won't actually achieve the security that you're looking for if they don't understand the sensitivity labels and when and how to apply them in the right circumstances.
Exactly. And ultimately, when you do roll out such a solution and you do get really good adoption of it, the resulting impact is you're making every person in your organization part of your security solution, right? If you think about it, when everyone in your organization understands what's sensitive to us and how should I protect it and how should I handle it, every single person is then protecting your corporate information. And that's how they're all part of your organization's security solution.
Agreed. And I think if you're going to enable, or if you're going to set up required sensitivity labels without a default, make sure that you're thinking about that carefully in terms of your adoption campaign. It might make it very hard to leave no person behind or leave no end user behind. And you're going to have to make sure that you think about this adoption campaign based on the different personas of users that you have within your organization. Please don't forget about new employees and contractors. If you have required sensitivity labeling turned on without a default, keep in mind that any new employee in your company won't be able to send a single email until they understand how to apply their sensitivity labels if they're going to hit that roadblock. They won't be able to save a single file until they understand the sensitivity labels and how to choose ones. When we think about it from that perspective, it makes it all the more important about how do we take something as complex as MIP, sensitivity labeling and security and compliance, and make it as simple as pie.
Right. And I think that just illustrates what the importance of some of the things that we talked about earlier, where it sounds like really simple decisions, like, what do I call this label that's going to be default? Do I choose a default? Do I make them required? They sound like simple decisions, but they have a huge impact on the actual user community. So it's important to take the time to really make solid decisions about those before you roll this out, and then test it as part of a proof of concept, and be willing to adjust based on what you see in the proof of concept.
Exactly. All right, so I think we're open at this point for questions. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat.
We do. I answered one of them while you were talking, the one about sublabels.
Okay.
So we didn't mention anything about sublabels, but sublabels are a great option. If you haven't seen them before, when you do have, let's say, a label like confidential, and you want something specialized around it for different groups within your organization, let's say confidential is going to protect information, it's going to encrypt it, but it's going to encrypt it differently for HR than it does for legal, than it does for the leadership team, than it does for everybody else. You can easily do that with sublabels. Overall, I would suggest that you keep the number of sublabels small because it does add to the complexity, as we talked about.
Yeah. So here's a question from Jim. How does auto encrypt show up in a day-to-day workflow?
Interesting. This is a good one. And there's some others around auto encrypt as well that we'll tackle in just a second. In the day-to-day workflow, there's a couple of different kinds of auto encrypt. There's auto encrypt on the client, which means when I am authoring a document in Word, Excel, or PowerPoint, or when I'm sending an email, you can configure MIP so that it automatically chooses a label for me, and a little message can appear telling you that this is automatically done as well. What happens there is the label is automatically applied. It can be chosen based on sensitive data that you find inside the document or the email. and then it will be applied to that thing automatically. But the user always has the option to change it. So although it's called auto labeling, it's really just an automatic selection in those client applications of the label. Ultimately, it's up to the user to decide what the label is before you send and what the label is when you save a document. And then there's auto labeling in the service, which means for email, when I'm sending an email, either outgoing or incoming email, as it's going through the mail transport, you can automatically apply a sensitivity label there. The end user experience there is essentially when you send an email, there's no difference. As it goes out and gets received by somebody, there's that little lock icon that appears on the email. Or if there's an incoming email and there's a policy that automatically applies a sensitivity label, it's going to appear with that lock icon when I receive it in my inbox. So that's the end user experience there. Then you have auto labeling in the service for SharePoint and OneDrive. And that is a service that will automatically iterate through your documents in SharePoint and OneDrive, looking for sensitive data and apply a sensitivity label. The experience there is pretty innocuous. You actually don't see anything as an end user on the documents or emails unless you turn on a built-in metadata column on your libraries called sensitivity, and then it will appear there. There are a few things, a few hoops you have to jump through, a few settings you have to turn on in order to make that happen. But that's the end user's experience there when auto labeling is turned on in the service. So remember, again, there's these two different kinds of auto labeling on the client and auto labeling in the service.
Great. Then we had another note from Eric who shared a URL to a PowerShell script that you can use to specify colors of your labels. And you know what, it's an interesting question. I've talked with different organizations about using colors in terms of headers, footers, or watermarks to display their labels. I think it's an attractive option, meaning I hear a lot of companies that want to look at that. The one thing I would say for everyone is that make sure that you talk to your internal accessibility teams about use of colors. They're going to have thoughts on different users across your company, whether or not they may have visual or different accessibility needs that will impact your use of a color, and exactly what colors. Your company may want you to use one of their company brand colors. They may want high contrast in those color schemes. So make sure that you're talking to your accessibility team. The other thing that I would make sure that you do, talk to your legal team. Because I have heard of some situations where legal teams have actually had concerns about headers, footers, and watermarks being added for sensitivity labels, especially if they have to regularly take copies of documents, take screenshots of them for litigation purposes, where having that header or footer or watermark might actually have some legal, they have a unique view on whether or not you have those. So please make sure that you do your due diligence by having that conversation internally before you turn on color coding of labels or even designating those, the fancier visual displays.
Sarah, I was referring to up in the bar in Word, the labeling bar, where you can apply a color there for the different labels.
Yeah,
I would say that that's, I think that, thank you, Eric. I think that just make sure that you have appropriate conversations about that. You're going to want to make sure that you test that for all of your different users, regardless of what channel they're on, whether they have light mode, dark mode. Not saying you shouldn't do it, but make sure that you're doing all of the appropriate testing and running that by your accessibility team. Because again, you don't want anything to get in the way of a user's ability to see and clearly be able to invoke the right sensitivity label.
Perfect. Thank you for that information.
Right. I was going to add a couple of points. So Eric, on your point, that PowerShell commandlet will actually set, like you're saying, in the toolbar, you can actually have a color on each button for the label. Sarah brought up great points about deciding whether you should or shouldn't use it and validating that with others in your organization for accessibility and legal concerns and so on. In some cultures, certain colors are not appropriate or considered, inappropriate. So important concerns there. Where I have seen that used is when an organization wants to use a red light, yellow light, green light type, like a stop signal type of model for sensitivity labels. I've seen some organizations adopt that kind of model where red means, red light means something, means stop, this is really sensitive. Yellow means there is some sensitivity to it, and green means no, you're good to go and to send this out. I have seen it used in some of those circumstances, but again, I would validate that from an accessibility standpoint, an HR standpoint, a cultural standpoint, a legal standpoint. The other thing I would add as well is when you do decide to apply markings to emails or documents, your marking does not have to be the same as your sensitivity label name. So I can have a label that's named confidential, but the marking that gets applied can be something else, right? It could be classification : confidential, or it could be some code as well that's put into certain kinds of documents. So sometimes you have those discussions with your legal team around, okay, we want to label these contract confidential, but we send them outside the organization, so we want that marking to appear slightly differently so that we internally know what it means, but so that external people don't necessarily know what it means. Because it can sometimes alarm people when you're sending something legitimately outside the organization and it's got confidential plastered over it. So those types of features are helpful when you're having those discussions with your legal team.
Okay, so Antonio, we do want to leave time for people to take a break before their next session begins. So I'm going to suggest we take one last question from Sean before we say thank you. His question or her question was, is it possible to change protection on an existing label and have those changes automatically flow to documents where the label has already been applied?
No, unfortunately. So it's a great question. When you do configure a set of labels and you roll them out to your organization and people are labeling their documents and emails and, you know, the world is happy, everyone's classifying their information and it's being protected. And then you decide to go change your label configuration, that does not automatically update the existing documents or emails that have been labeled. You necessarily need to go back to your documents and open them and save them. Now, if you're using automated policies in the service to apply labels, then in those cases, you can have those auto apply policies change the labels on documents. There's another question that came up about using MCAS to auto apply labels, which is actually a good strategy. I have a love-hate relationship with the auto apply policies. You can use them to change the labels on your content that's sitting in the cloud. But there's a lot of limitations around them, and it's important to know what those are before you do start configuring auto apply policies. So great question, but unfortunately, no, changing your label configuration does not automatically change the labels on content that's already been labeled.
Great answer. Thank you so much, Antonio. It's been great. Thank you, everyone, for the fantastic questions and comments. And before you leave, don't go anywhere yet, because Doug, I think, is going to help us out with a gift card giveaway. Doug, are you there?
Should be. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Headset's having a lot of fun today. Just grabbing a couple of the names here and going to spin the wheel of possibilities.
I feel like I should do a drum roll.
Right, if only I could have one autoplay. Our winner for the gift card in this session is Matt McClure.
Congratulations, Matt.
Congratulations.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed the session today and have a great rest of the conference. Thank you, Antonio.
Thanks, Sarah. Great as always. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
Thank you both. And then we have about 10 minutes until our next presentation on this channel. So feel free to take a quick break, stretch your legs.
So in the chat, Doug, I went ahead and said stop recording, and then I'll go ahead and put a link into our schedule so people